So, hello to everybody. Xavier, you're there. I see. Welcome to our afternoon session on the Hamiltonian moment, something we started to discuss evidently in some weeks ago, and that we're very happy to organize together Forum New Economy with OFCE and Xavier Rago and Jérôme in Paris as one part of our continuous collaboration on new paradigms, and especially in cooperation with Jakob von Weizsäcker and Agnès Benassi-Curé, who both aren't yet there, if I see correctly, but who will, okay, see you. Bonjour Agnès, I think Jakob is still missing. Hello, hello to Paris, and well,
nice to see you, Thomas.
Thank you, and me too, in these times. So I'm very happy to have a small group, but a very high-level group. That's what we wanted to have, a first discussion on the Hamiltonian moment. Hello, there's Jakob joining. I see, to have a discussion, a high-level expert discussion on, is there a Hamiltonian moment already? Has there been one? Should there be another one? And these questions based on all the political decisions around the Resilient Recovery Fund in summer. And the idea is to have a very expert level discussion, which means also very importantly that this is a discussion with Chatham House rules. So if anyone wants to quote, especially our two finance ministry participants, but also the others, please join, please consult them and ask them if that's okay for them. This is there to have a real fruitful and open discussion that we will have in the course of this afternoon. The idea behind is also to sort out what are the open questions when further research is needed, where further studies are needed, and to eventually then have another event which will then be more public, more open to broader public, broader discussion next year. So that's from my part essentially what I wanted to say to start. I hand over to Xavier to say some words on this afternoon. Please, Xavier.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. We are so happy at OFCE to organize things with a new paradigm on this very important subject. I think, step by step in various formats, small group and then bigger event and so on and so on. We try to elaborate a new view of a new consensus at the European level in thinking about Europe dynamics, fiscal policy, macroeconomic coordination, institution buildings. So we need to discuss all the complex detail about how to make Europe work better than it does actually, and could be improved in this dimension. So we are very happy and we will continue to support all initiatives at the European level. OFCE is moving more and more toward this kind of institutional European issue. So I'm happy, nothing else to say. Chatham House prevail. So we discussed with Thomas, I will just share the first session, then Thomas the second, and the third one, we will co-chair the third one, just to organize things. The idea is, as Thomas said, to have many exchange, many intervention, question, and elaboration together. So I'm first very happy to start giving the floor to Moritz Schularick. Hi, Moritz, and Anne-Laure Delatte. Thanks a lot for being here. And
well, thank you very much, Xavier. Thank you, Thomas. I hope you can all hear me. Maybe one of you can nod and then know that everything is fine.
Yes, so you know you have something 10 to 15 minutes, okay. Moritz, and then Agnès, and I think Mark will organize the, so if you want to intervene, yes, practical thing. ask it in the chat. I think it's better. And as we have a small group, I think we will be able to intervene directly after the two presentations to ask questions and to elaborate. So Moritz, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. You can hear me? Everything's fine? Yeah, good. Thanks, Xavier. Thanks, Thomas, for inviting me. I'm very pleased and honored to kick this off together with Anne-Laure. And I'm very excited to discuss these questions. I have actually prepared a 90-minute lecture on early American fiscal history. So I hope you all have So what I want to make a few points. Essentially, I want to make 3 points looking back at what good old Alexander Hamilton, and I have not seen the musical. I hear it's a little bit controversial these days, but I have not seen it. What he actually did and what the genius was, and maybe what we can learn from that. And I'll try to relay the sort of the economic financial history to what we're interested in today. Okay, so what happened, and I think you all know this, but just to refresh your memories, is that the US fought, Americans fought the Revolutionary War against the British. In the process, the individual states incurred a lot of debt, and that became a very unstable situation. So George Washington in 1789 gave Alexander Hamilton effectively 100 days to sort out the future fiscal constitution or financial constitution of the US. Hamilton then worked closely with Jefferson and Madison to hash out a compromise that we now kind of call the Hamiltonian moment. As usual, there's been some horse trading, and it's not been just some strike of genius, but it laid the foundation for what is the modern financial and fiscal constitution of the US. And at least so far, it has worked reasonably well. So what is the key element here? And I think you have heard the story in one way or the other, is that in the Continental Congress did not have any tax ability. So the federal center, maybe much like the EU today, was effectively relying on the individual states that made up the Confederation to raise resources. That was, however, a problem because the individual states had very different fiscal situations. Again, that sort of rhymes with the European situation. And what Hamilton then came up with, as the debts of many of these states, some had repaid. Virginia famously had already repaid all the Revolutionary War debts and was sort of the austerity champion of the time. And Jefferson had to pull over for that reason, and I'll get to that in a minute. Was that the fiscal situation of the individual states was very different. Some were really in dire straits, and something had to happen. If we look at the numbers, total U.S. debt, I think Anne-Laure will tell us a little bit more about this in the second intervention. We're talking about something like 30 to 40% of GDP. That doesn't sound much by modern standards, but if you realize that it's something also that we need to pay attention to in the European debate, that back then governments were very small, and typical government share in GDP in the US would be below 5% until the 1930s. So we're talking in terms of the revenues that were actually there to service that debt. We're talking about probably like 10 times annual fiscal revenue. If you think about, that maybe in Europe today, fiscal revenues are somewhere between 30 and 40% of GDP each year, then we're talking about 300 to 400% debt to GDP ratios. Obviously, that's a stretch comparison in the sense that back then the possibilities to raise revenue were arguably higher than at the level we are now in Europe. And I think that's an important insight to keep on board, is that when we make these comparisons, we are talking basically about sort of classical liberal, small government, small states, that didn't tax very much, and where there was a lot of potential to raise revenue over time. That might be something that we do not have to the same degree in Europe. Anyway, so let me move on. What was this famous compromise about? The famous compromise was essentially that the federal level assumed all the war debts, and there was a massive redistribution in that because, as I said, some states like Virginia had already repaid them. Others were, you know, more on the side of, now we'll deal with this later, or let's see what we do eventually. Some were openly threatening to default. So Hamilton, the compromise was that the federal center took over all these debts. In exchange, the federal center got the right to tax. These taxes were luxury taxes, mainly on booze, on whiskey and other alcohol, plus the authority to raise tariffs, which then Hamilton, in his famous sort of strategy and sort of writing on the manufacturing industry in the US, used heavily for sort of a very protectionist trade regime in the US in the following decades that you know, to the surprise of many economic historians, worked rather well in building an industrial base in the US. The other point of the compromise, and a very important one, was that in exchange for taking over the debts, you had to give something. There had to be some political horse trading. You had to give something to the you know, to the Germanys of the time, which was Virginia most famously. And what Virginia got as a political bargain, or as a political chip and something to be proud of, was that the capital, the new capital, Washington, D.C., effectively moved down there, close to Virginia. Plus, and I'll come to this in 1 minute, there were, of course, kind of far-reaching rules, or at least until the 1840s, they were sort of a little bit unclear, but then they became clearer that a similar situation wouldn't happen again, that the center would bail out the federal states. So what was the political genius now of that strike? And I think that is something that is something, if you let it sink in, is really also something that Europe needs to think about. It is effectively turning a liability, which were these unstable, unsecured, very volatile financial assets, which were the individual states' debts, turning these liabilities, maybe think about them sort of along the lines of Italian government debt or Greek government debt a while ago, turn these clear liabilities and very volatile, speculative, default risky securities into an asset that the emerging American bourgeoisie, the rich people in America bought into, because Hamilton turned these liabilities into a safe asset. And in terms of the political economy, he was very smart in seeing the potential to get the buy-in from the rich Americans. It's typically rich people who own a lot of government debt because they have a lot of wealth and they want to have it in safe assets as well. To have this buy-in mechanism through which, sort of on the sociological and political economy side, rich America became, on the top 10 of the wealth distribution, we call it these days, became stakeholders in that new American fiscal enterprise. So he was very shrewd in buying in the rich, the powerful, the well-established into that new fiscal enterprise. And I think if we think about Europe, we don't want to do this against, from a German perspective, you would say like the Southwest, where the wealth and the fortunes lie. Let me hand over to Anne-Laure in just 1 second. Just make two more quick comments. One is an obvious one from an historical point of view. We're in this business of kind of looking where is Europe relative to the US back then. It's also clear that the financial constitution of the US was not finished in a day. It took another 130 years for the US to clarify the relations between the center and the individual states. Importantly, the 1840s, when there were default crises in various states, they That was the moment when effectively a kind of no bailout clause was established. And I think that is an idea that we need to discuss. Even if we turn out, we're probably all very pro-European in this round, but even if we turn out and say like, oh, this is a good idea, we have some kind of debt swap on the European level, and this is the way to cement the European nation or federation, we will still need to think about the case where there is a new government in some country that likes to issue a lot of debt and maybe gets into a crisis in 20 years. And how do we sort out the incentives and the center periphery is the wrong word, or center state relations here. The other point is Hamilton's second step was to establish a central bank, and he also got that, but then it didn't last, and then it took until 1913 to really get a central bank. I think this is one of the big advantages that Europe has. We have an advantage in that we have a well-functioning and very competent central bank that is in place that took the US 120 years. Let me conclude with one thought, which is ultimately, and I want to relate that to, draw maybe two big conclusions from that Hamiltonian experiment or moment, the debt assumption of the center in exchange for fiscal powers, taxing authorities. Why did it work? Well, it wasn't clear that it would work. It worked because it turned out to be very successful. And had America lost the War of 1812, we probably wouldn't talk about the Hamiltonian moment anymore. But America didn't lose the war, and America developed very well, and America got, at least over time, after the 1840s, also the other institutions broadly right that made sure that, we don't have in 150 years, we don't have a long, there's always some cases like Illinois and New York in the 70s, but overall, it set a system in place where also the individual states were reasonably responsible with their fiscal matters. So success is a big part of the ingredient. And if I can move now to the present, if I look at what happened to the European Recovery Fund and how it got dragged down and how the Commission took a very technocratic and approach to what happens with these monies, and I don't want to blame the Commission alone. There was a lot of horse trading in the background, as you all know. I'm not very optimistic that people understand that to the degree that we now have a Hamiltonian, sort of a little bit of a small Hamiltonian moment in Europe, we really need to show the public that this works, that there's a point in giving this to the center, and that means that there's an enormous responsibility on the shoulders of Brussels, the Commission, and all the European institutions to show that this is actually a successful experiment. And had it not worked in the US, I'm pretty sure we would have had, exactly the same sort of critical questions coming up that are there now. I was a big supporter of that European Stabilization Fund or recovery program. I must say I'm already 6 or 3 months later, I'm not very happy in the way it's managed. And I think we need to, at any point in time, tell our friends in Brussels that there's an enormous responsibility that they have now to show to 300, 400, 500 million Europeans that it's actually worth giving resources to the center to fight these catastrophes. Second point, Virginia, horse trading, is Germany the new Virginia? What can we offer in terms of bargaining chips? We had this in another fantastic event with the New Economy Forum last week. I think, and this is for Agnes and for Anne-Laure and for others in the round, I think the marriage proposal, the fiscal federation proposal will have to come from the French side. There's a deep-seated feeling in Germany that France has still not given up on the de Gaullean vision that Europe is a way to extend French influence in the world by leveraging the German balance sheet and the German economy, while it is inherently unable or unwilling to give up its nation-state framework. So I think the proposal will have to come from the French side, and it will have to be honest and straightforward, and it will have to say goodbye to l'État-nation in France. These are my 2 points, and I happily discuss more and hand over to Anne-Laure, and hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Moritz. You anticipated a little bit the debate, but that's great. It launches lots of actual questions. So Anne-Laure, thank you.
Hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay, thank you. I actually prepared a 90-minute lecture about American history, but that was like 5 years ago, and I just borrowed a few slides of my lecture 5 years ago to prepare this presentation. So thank you so much, Xavier, to give me the opportunity to discuss this important topic. We'll see together if the comparison is legitimate and what we can learn from the US precedent. I'll try not to replicate what Moritz just explained very clearly. Let me just get back to, I'm sure that there will be some replicate, but that might make things clear for everyone. So yeah, you put it very clearly. There was an accumulation of independence war debt at the end of the war. The total US debt was 80 billion compared to 180 billion GDP, but you gave a much more sensitive comparison, comparing it to fiscal revenues at that time. Maybe what we want to know is that 30% of this debt was had been issued by the states, and 70% by the federal government, including domestic and foreign debt. And that's interesting. France was the major debt holder of US federal government debt at that time. There was actually a strong financial asymmetry across states, and you also mentioned the fact that we had most of them being largely indebted and few others being creditors. And you mentioned Virginia and also North Carolina, which would be the Germany and the Netherlands of today. That triggered two reflexes, which were dangerous for the balance of the Union: heavy-handed use of tax and heavy-handed use of fiat money in indebted states to redeem their debt. So that would produce high inflation, for example, in Rhode Island, and low growth potential. And you also explained it clearly, and that's a very important element of the story. There was a concurrent access, a competition between the states and the federal government to the same tax base. So actually, that would, Hamilton understood that it puts a potential threat on the balance of the Union, because states and the federal government would compete on the same tax base. So there was a great need to reduce the necessity of tax at the state level and prevent ruinous competition. That's why Hamilton advocated the restructuring of federal and state debt obligations, which would consist in converting outstanding obligation into long-term federal bonds, meaning a total assumption of the state's debt by the central government. So that, if Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, they all agree on the importance of a monetary union, there was a huge controversy about that assumption. And as Frieden recently put it, there are differences in people's interests that lead to differences of opinion on how the union macroeconomic goals should be achieved. And that should ring a bell to the current European context. But if you think about it, that's very interesting. You have, first of all, different interests, which you will find in the American politics even today. With Jefferson on the one hand, who favored states' rights and easy money, he would be the father of the Republican, and Hamilton, who would be the father of the Democrats, favored federal power to control fractions, so a strong federal government, and hard money to secure financial stability. So that was the first conflict across the US. And the second one, which rings a bell in the current context, was that there was a moral hazard argument put forward by Virginia and North Carolina that it was unfair to have careful states like them bailed out profligate states like Massachusetts and South Carolina. And what Hamilton did is that he found a compromise to align those conflicting interests. So quickly, he converted 98% of outstanding paper securities of the states and the federal government into securities at the official power of exchange. And it was a major success very quickly, since US government securities became quickly accepted both at home and abroad. The yield felt close to French yield. And it actually opened, I will come back to this, but it actually opened the access to international financial market to the new United States. There was a second element, which was super important in the deal. It was the settlement of Revolutionary War accounts, consisting in equalizing the cost of independence across states according to population. So the creditors received balances in the form of these new federal debt securities, which actually yield interest revenue. So there was a benefit to this. And there was also an idea of fairness in this deal. And as you mentioned it already, Moritz, all this deal would not have been possible without the establishment of the first Bank of the United States that helped managing the assumed debt, produce fiscal resources, would issue loans to support government spending. And we could spend 2 hours just on the establishment of this BUS. I'll just get back very quickly to it, comparing to the ECB, the current ECB. So just to draw some lessons, the debt assumption became a cornerstone of the monetary union. Why? Because first, by unifying financial situations across the states, debt unification mitigated tensions between creditor and debtor states. It also secured allegiance of debt holders and bound the states to the union. And I'll get back to this allegiance, political allegiance to the union. Also, by aligning the issuance of debt with tax base, it avoided debt crises and ensured the sustainability and credibility of the monetary union for a long time. Even if, as Moritz said, it took actually 130 years to become a sustainable and stable currency. But at least they would avoid debt crisis until 1840, and the way it would be settled would be very different than it was under Hamilton. It led to the creation of a US government bond market, which gave access to this new sovereign to international credit. So there are two important lessons that have been put forward by Rokoff and by Frieden. First, why did people accept this deal? Because benefits exceeded costs. And actually, even for the creditors, they saw their interest in equalizing war costs and assuming the debt. And that Hamilton offered a solution to a problem that the individual states could not solve on their own. So in today's context, I'd say, and I'll open the debate with these two last slides. Obviously, I don't think we can speak about debt assumption, but a relief. The European Commission will actually borrow and transfer funds to the states, with a major capital letter, sorry, to help absorbing the COVID shock. So it's a relief and not an assumption. It reduces the need to increase debt for, it just reduces the need to increase debt for Italy, Spain, and some countries which need these revenues. It's a major second difference. It's a one-shot access to international financial market. We're not issuing the equivalent of the T-bond at that time. Third, the establishment of the Bank of the United States was a prerequisite to debt assumption, while the ECB already exists and so far had assumed most of debt crisis management. While Hamilton plan, the crisis management, the potential debt crisis management was settled by the debt assumption, and BUS was a way, the Bank of the United States was a way to operate this debt assumption. I think we're in a very different state here, where ECB has assumed most of the crisis management so far, and the EU recovery plan is trying to reduce the burden of the ECB in crisis management. So it's a different situation. But if there is something where we can draw a parallel, I think, is that during the COVID pandemic, the executive polity in Europe has managed to, for the first time, to coordinate conflicting interests across the zone. And that might be the reason why we want to call it a Hamiltonian moment. Okay, that's my last slide. I wouldn't call it so far. It's probably too early to tell if it's a Hamiltonian moment, but what can we make to make it what can we do to make it a Hamilton moment? I'd say build a legitimate supranational level of governance to produce compromise and align interests, as Hamilton found a compromise to align conflicting interests. A corollary of this is that it will help reducing the burden of crisis management on ECB. My second point is secure the funding of the plan to secure political allegiance. We don't have a solution so far to fund the EU recovery plan. We will open very conflicting discussion about own resources, own fiscal resources in the future. So that's probably a key point. To secure political allegiance of the states, the member states, to Europe, to the EU. And my last point is make it a permanent borrowing capacity to, as Hamilton did by issuing T-bonds. You can think about this borrowing capacity as a way, if you make it permanent, to produce common goods, such as climate protection, such as education and improvement, or research funding, to produce common goods to better resist next shocks that will probably be quite numerous in the near future. I'm done.